Something just happened on the global stage, and both sides are telling completely different stories. Today, April 17th, the President of the United States said Iran had agreed to give up its highly enriched uranium stockpile. The White House framed it as a major diplomatic breakthrough and suggested a broader nuclear deal could now be close. But minutes later, Tehran pushed back publicly. Iranian officials say that version of events is false, and they described their enriched uranium as being as sacred as their national soil. Their message was simple: this material will not be transferred outside the country. This is not just a minor wording dispute. It is a direct and public contradiction between Washington and Tehran on the most sensitive part of the negotiations. And that matters because the central issue is not the headline. It is who controls the uranium. If you want clear, fast breakdowns of what is really happening behind major global headlines, subscribe now. This story is moving quickly, and the public messaging is changing by the hour. So let's step past the talking points and look at the hard reality behind the Iranian nuclear file. At the center of this crisis is roughly 450 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60% purity, according to recent international reporting and outside estimates. That number is what gives this story its weight. This is not standard civilian fuel. It is material that sits alarmingly close to weapons grade. And that is where many people misunderstand the situation. 60% does not mean Iran is only a little more than halfway to weapons grade. In nuclear enrichment, the hardest work happens earlier in the process. By the time you reach 60%, much of the technical effort has already been done. That is why this stockpile causes so much concern in Washington, in Europe, and at the International Atomic Energy Agency. Many analysts believe that moving from 60% to 90% is far easier than getting from natural uranium to 60. The final step is shorter, faster, and far more dangerous than most headlines suggest. According to Western estimates and outside non-proliferation analysis, if that stockpile were enriched further, it could provide enough material for multiple nuclear weapons. That is why the debate is not about symbolism. It is about breakout time, leverage, and whether diplomacy still has room to work. This also helps explain why the United States is focused so heavily on physical removal. From Washington's perspective, as long as that uranium remains inside Iran, the core threat remains in place. A promise on paper is one thing. Control of the material is another. Iran, however, has been signaling a different position. Iranian officials say forms of downblending or technical adjustment could reduce the immediate weapons risk, but they continue to insist that the material must remain inside the country. That is the central collision in these talks. And that collision becomes even more serious because the international monitoring system is weaker than it used to be. According to the IAEA, the agency no longer has the level of access it once had, and oversight has been severely reduced. That means the outside world is working with less visibility than before. Inspectors have faced restrictions, surveillance tools have been removed, and on-the-ground verification has narrowed sharply, according to the IAEA's recent reporting. So even when public figures cite stockpile numbers with confidence, the broader picture is still clouded by uncertainty. The world is watching more from a distance than from inside the facilities. So here is the reality today. Washington says a deal is near. Tehran says no such concession has been made, and the uranium, the one variable that matters most in the long term, has not moved. If Iran sees that stockpile as untouchable, then what kind of agreement is actually possible? Drop your view in the comments. Is this real progress, or is it mostly political optics? And if you are following this story closely, subscribe so you do not miss the next update. To understand why the material is so difficult to control, you also have to understand where it is being kept. Key parts of Iran's nuclear infrastructure are buried deep underground, in hardened facilities designed to survive airstrikes and external attacks. That was tested during the military escalations of June 2025. According to Western reporting and defense assessments, U.S. and Israeli strikes hit parts of Iran's nuclear infrastructure, but the deeper underground sections proved far harder to eliminate. Surface damage is one thing, permanently erasing buried nuclear capacity is something else entirely. That is why military pressure alone has not solved this problem. Even when above-ground systems are damaged, the deeper facilities can remain relevant, and if enriched uranium survives underground, the issue becomes one of access and recovery, not necessarily destruction. This is also why Iranian rhetoric matters. When officials describe enriched uranium as sacred national soil, they are not just making a dramatic statement for television. They are tying the material to sovereignty, national pride, and long-term strategic leverage. Inside Iran, the nuclear program is often presented not just as a technical project, but as a symbol of independence. So for Tehran, giving up the stockpile is not framed as a technical concession. It is framed as surrendering a strategic asset under foreign pressure. That is a major reason why the current standoff looks so difficult to resolve. The United States wants the material gone. Iran wants the material to stay. One side sees physical removal as essential, the other sees retention as a matter of sovereignty. And the contrast becomes even sharper when you look at how far the program has moved from the old diplomatic baseline. According to the terms of the 2015 nuclear agreement, Iran was capped at much lower enrichment levels and faced far tighter monitoring. Today, the enrichment level is dramatically higher, and oversight is far weaker. The stockpile itself has also grown far beyond the limits envisioned under that earlier framework, according to international estimates. That does not just mean more uranium, it means more leverage, more uncertainty, and a much smaller margin for diplomatic error than existed a decade ago. Iranian negotiators are also constrained by politics at home. Many analysts believe hardline factions inside the country have repeatedly warned against major concessions on the nuclear program. So even if diplomacy continues, Tehran's room to compromise may be narrower than public messaging suggests. That helps explain why outside proposals have become so ambitious. Reports have circulated about possible financial relief packages, sanctions relief, and broader side arrangements meant to secure a deal. The idea appears to be simple. If military pressure cannot force the issue, perhaps economic incentives can. But that raises a difficult question. Can money buy zero enrichment from a government that sees nuclear capability as long-term insurance against outside pressure? That is where the negotiation becomes more than technical. It becomes strategic, ideological, and deeply political. Even if a large financial package were offered, critics would immediately ask what exactly is being purchased. Is the world buying a permanent solution or only a temporary pause? That distinction matters because a pause can calm headlines without resolving the underlying risk. The timeline dispute inside the talks points to the same problem. According to Western reporting, the United States wants a much longer freeze on enrichment, while Iran appears willing to discuss something far shorter. If confirmed, that gap is not procedural. It reflects a basic lack of trust between the two sides. And trust is already in short supply, because uranium at 60% has little clear civilian justification at this scale, according to many non-proliferation experts. That is why so many analysts view this stockpile as a latent weapons option rather than a normal energy asset. It gives Tehran leverage without requiring it to cross the final line. This strategy is often described as nuclear latency. A country remains just below the threshold of openly building a bomb, but still gains the political and military leverage that comes from being close. It is the power of being almost there. That kind of leverage reaches beyond the nuclear file itself. It shapes regional calculations, affects allied responses, and changes how neighboring states think about deterrence, survival, and escalation. A near-threshold program does not stay confined to one border. It changes the entire neighborhood. Across the Gulf, other governments are watching closely. Many analysts believe that if the final outcome leaves Iran with the material, the infrastructure, and the know-how, regional states will conclude that the global system has effectively accepted a permanent near-nuclear state in the region. That would have consequences far beyond this one negotiation. Mediators have tried to find a middle path. One idea is transferring the uranium to a third country rather than directly handing it to the United States. On paper, that sounds like a compromise. In practice, it is still extremely difficult. Third country transfer deals depend on trust, timing, enforcement, and political durability. And history is not especially encouraging here. Similar arrangements in the past have struggled or collapsed because neither side wanted to be the one taking the bigger risk first. That is why the Iranian statement matters so much. If Tehran is already publicly rejecting transfer as unacceptable, then even the compromise option looks shaky. And if transfer is off the table, the room for a meaningful deal narrows fast. There is also another problem. Even if an agreement is reached, it may not come in the form of a fully ratified long-term treaty. It could be a looser political understanding, more vulnerable to reversal if leadership changes or tensions flare again. We have seen that before. Agreements can be announced with great confidence, only to unravel later when administrations change or political pressure rises. That is especially dangerous in a case like this, because nuclear infrastructure does not disappear when headlines move on. And the phrase zero enrichment may not even mean the same thing to both sides. For Washington, it likely means dismantling or permanently neutralizing the capacity to resume. For Tehran, it may mean only a temporary halt while keeping the machinery, expertise, and infrastructure intact. That difference is enormous. A pause in spinning centrifuges is not the same as removing the ability to spin them again, and in a crisis measured by breakout time, that distinction is everything. There is also the problem of uncertainty beyond the declared sites. Because international access has been reduced for so long, outside powers cannot rule out the possibility of undeclared facilities or undisclosed activity. That does not prove hidden infrastructure exists, but it does make verification far harder. And once verification weakens, every agreement becomes more fragile. A deal only works if both sides can measure compliance. If the world cannot confidently verify what is happening, then even a signed deal may do less to reduce risk than people hope. Beyond enrichment itself, there is the separate issue of weaponization. Producing highly enriched uranium is one step. Turning that material into an actual deployable device involves additional technical stages, some of which are much harder to monitor from afar. That matters because satellites can show buildings, traffic, and visible activity. They cannot easily reveal every detail of what engineers may or may not be doing inside sealed facilities. So the intelligence picture is incomplete by definition. This is one reason why sabotage and cyber operations have been used in the past, but those tools also have limits. They can delay a program, disrupt machinery, and buy time. They do not necessarily erase technical knowledge or permanently end industrial capacity. And Iran's centrifuge technology has advanced over time. According to Western assessments, newer systems are faster and more efficient than older ones, which means diplomatic failure today could become more dangerous more quickly than it would have a decade ago. That brings us back to the most important number in this story: breakout time. The shorter that window becomes, the less space diplomats have to react. And that is why this current contradiction matters so much. It is not just embarrassing politically, it is dangerous strategically. If Washington says a deal is close, but Tehran refuses the one concession the United States appears to want most, then the underlying threat remains unresolved. And if the threat remains unresolved, the reassuring headlines become much harder to trust. If these negotiations collapse, the consequences could be immediate. Economic pressure would likely intensify. Military signaling would rise again. Regional actors would prepare for escalation, and the fragile calm now being presented to the public could disappear very quickly. But military action still offers no clean solution. Striking fortified nuclear facilities is one thing, Permanently ending a program built underground, backed by technical expertise, and protected by national resolve, is another. That is why diplomacy remains necessary, even when diplomacy looks weak, which leads to a sobering conclusion. The real debate may not be whether the world can force Iran to surrender its nuclear leverage. The real debate may be whether the world is settling for paying to delay it. And if that is the case, then this is not just a story about one negotiation. It is a story about a changing global order, where near nuclear capability itself becomes a bargaining chip powerful enough to reshape diplomacy, security, and regional balance. If a country can enrich to 60%, survive major strikes, resist full transparency, and still negotiate from a position of strength, other governments will notice. Many analysts believe that kind of precedent would put enormous strain on the global non-proliferation system. That is why this moment matters beyond Washington and Tehran. The outcome here will be studied far beyond the Middle East. It will shape how rivals, allies, and future proliferators think about pressure, deterrence, and the value of staying just below the line. Right now, there is still no confirmed agreement on the one issue that matters most: control of the material itself. Until that changes, nothing fundamental has changed, no matter how optimistic the public messaging becomes. So, the defining question remains simple. If Iran refuses to transfer the uranium, what kind of deal is actually left to make? And if the answer is no clear deal at all, then the world may be much closer to another crisis than today's headlines are willing to admit.